Mark and Elena had always believed that their biggest problem was communication, that if they could just find the right words, the right timing, the right emotional tone, everything would finally make sense again. But what neither of them wanted to admit was that the silence between them had started to feel more honest than their conversations, because every time they spoke, they were carefully choosing what not to say, avoiding certain memories, certain feelings, certain truths that felt too heavy to carry out loud. And Mark noticed how Elena's presence had changed, how her attention no longer fully rested in the room, how her eyes drifted away even when she was listening. And it made him reflect on how love doesn't usually end with a clear rupture. It fades through a slow accumulation of emotional distance, through postponed conversations, through unresolved disappointments that quietly settle into the body. And Elena, in her own way, felt the same tension, sensing that Mark was still physically there, but emotionally somewhere else, holding on to a version of her that no longer existed, expecting her to feel the same things, want the same future, carry the same emotional weight. And what hurt the most wasn't the conflict, it was the feeling of being misunderstood in silence, of sharing space with someone who once knew her deeply, but now seemed to observe her from a distance. And both of them felt trapped in a strange emotional loop, afraid to leave because of what they had built, but equally afraid to stay because of what they were becoming. And in that fragile space between attachment and detachment, they began to realize that the real tragedy wasn't losing each other. It was slowly losing themselves while pretending everything was still the same, holding on to memories instead of reality, choosing familiarity over honesty, and quietly negotiating with the idea that sometimes love doesn't fail because people stop caring, but because they start growing in different directions and don't know how to admit it without destroying what once felt like home. Elena started to notice that her sadness was no longer tied to specific moments or arguments. It had become a constant emotional background, a quiet heaviness that followed her even during ordinary days. And what disturbed her most was how normal it began to feel, as if emotional dissatisfaction had slowly turned into a habit. And she reflected on how often she smiled out of reflex, how many times she said, "It's fine," without checking if it was true, how she learned to adjust her emotional expectations downward just to maintain stability. And Mark and his own internal world felt a different kind of tension. Not sadness, but emotional exhaustion. The feeling that he was constantly trying to repair something without fully understanding what was broken. Sensing that no matter how much effort he invested, something fundamental between them remained unresolved. And this imbalance created a subtle emotional distance, where both of them were still trying but no longer in the same direction. And Elena realized that what she missed most wasn't passion or excitement. It was emotional clarity, the feeling of knowing where she stood in someone's inner world. And Mark realized that what frightened him most wasn't separation, but the possibility that he had already emotionally separated without noticing, continuing the relationship more out of habit than desire. And this realization unsettled both of them because it challenged the narrative they had been telling themselves that love simply needed more patience, more compromise, more communication, when in reality, what it might need was honesty about change, about disappointment, about the fear of admitting that the version of them that once worked together no longer existed in the same form, and that staying connected was slowly becoming more painful than letting go. Mark began to understand that what he avoided most was not conflict with Elena, but conflict with himself, because acknowledging the emotional distance between them meant confronting his own responsibility in creating it. Admitting how often he chose comfort over confrontation, routine over reflection, and how slowly he stopped questioning whether he was still emotionally present or simply physically available. And Elena, sensing this shift, found herself oscillating between hope and resignation, sometimes interpreting his small gestures as signs that things could still change, other times feeling that those gestures were just echoes of a past intimacy that no longer had a living emotional core. And this emotional ambiguity created a fragile space where neither of them felt fully committed or fully detached, as if they were both waiting for the other to initiate a truth they were too afraid to articulate themselves. And Mark reflected on how relationships rarely collapse in dramatic ways. They dissolve through unresolved conversations, through unspoken expectations, through emotional needs that remain invisible until they become unbearable. And Elena reflected on how much of her identity had become tied to preserving the relationship, to adjusting her desires, her boundaries, her emotional voice, just to maintain balance. And this realization made her question whether love should feel like continuous self negotiation or whether it should allow space for personal authenticity without fear of destabilizing everything. And both of them began to sense that what they were experiencing wasn't simply a crisis, but a quiet transformation, a moment where the relationship was forcing them to choose between emotional honesty and emotional safety, between staying loyal to what they once were or allowing themselves to become something new, even if that meant becoming separate. Elena noticed that the hardest part wasn't the uncertainty itself, but how lonely it felt to carry it alone. Because even though Mark was still there, sharing the same space, the same routines, the same history, she no longer felt emotionally accompanied, and this absence created a strange form of isolation, where intimacy existed only as memory, not as experience. And she reflected on how often she wanted to express her doubts, but stopped herself out of fear of opening a conversation she wasn't ready to finish, while Mark found himself increasingly aware of how much energy he spent maintaining emotional neutrality, avoiding strong reactions, avoiding deep conversations, avoiding anything that might disrupt the fragile stability they had built around their unresolved feelings. And this emotional restraint began to feel heavier than any argument because it required constant self-monitoring, constant suppression of discomfort, constant negotiation with silence. And both of them started to sense that what they were protecting was not the relationship itself, but the image of it, the version that still felt familiar, predictable, and safe, even if it no longer reflected their inner reality. And Elena realized that familiarity can sometimes be more dangerous than conflict because it allows emotional stagnation to masquerade as peace. And Mark realized that stability without emotional truth slowly erodes authenticity, turning connection into coexistence. And in this shared but unspoken awareness, they began to understand that the real risk wasn't in changing their situation, it was in allowing it to remain unchanged while pretending it still represented who they were becoming. Mark started to remember the early version of their relationship, not with nostalgia, but with a strange sense of distance, as if he was observing someone else's life, someone who once believed that love naturally evolved without needing constant emotional recalibration. And this realization made him aware of how much he had relied on the idea of permanence, on the assumption that feelings would sustain themselves if nothing actively destroyed them, while Elena began to notice how her emotional needs had shifted over time, becoming more nuanced, more internal, more connected to her sense of identity rather than to external validation. And this divergence created a subtle imbalance where both of them were still loyal to the relationship, but no longer aligned in what they expected it to provide. And Mark reflected on how often he interpreted Elena's emotional distance as dissatisfaction with him, rather than as a sign of her own internal transformation, while Elena reflected on how often she blamed herself for feeling disconnected, believing that something inside her was broken or ungrateful for wanting more emotional depth. And this mutual misinterpretation kept them locked in a cycle of self-doubt and emotional restraint, where neither felt entitled to express their true experience without invalidating the other's. And slowly they began to realize that their suffering was not caused by lack of love, but by the inability to acknowledge that love alone was no longer enough to sustain the version of connection they were trying to preserve. As the tension continued to exist without resolution, both Mark and Elena started to sense that the relationship itself had become a mirror, reflecting not only their shared history but also their individual fears. Mark's fear of instability, of losing something familiar even if it no longer felt fulfilling, and Elena's fear of emotional invisibility, of remaining in a connection where her inner growth felt unnoticed and unsupported. And this mirror forced them to confront questions they had avoided for months, questions about whether staying was an act of loyalty or an act of fear, whether compromise had turned into self-erasure, whether patience had become a way to postpone inevitable change. And these reflections didn't immediately lead to clarity, but they created an emotional pressure that made silence increasingly uncomfortable, because silence now felt like a decision rather than an absence of words. And both of them began to understand that whatever came next, whether separation or transformation, would require a form of honesty that could no longer be postponed without consequence. Not because the relationship was broken, but because it was demanding a different kind of truth than the one they had been telling themselves. Mark found himself lying awake more often, not because of insomnia, but because his thoughts refused to settle, replaying small moments with Elena that once felt insignificant, but now seemed charged with meaning. The pauses in her responses, the way she avoided eye contact when certain topics emerged, the subtle emotional distance that had replaced what used to feel like effortless closeness. And he realized how long he had been ignoring these signals, convincing himself that stability meant silence, that as long as there were no major conflicts, everything must be fine, while Elena, in her own quiet way, was experiencing a different kind of wakefulness, not physical but emotional, a constant internal dialogue questioning whether she was still choosing the relationship or merely maintaining it, whether her presence was an expression of love or an avoidance of loneliness. And this uncertainty made her feel increasingly disconnected from herself, as if part of her identity had been placed on hold in order to preserve something that no longer reflected who she was becoming. And both of them started to sense that the real conflict was not between them, but within them, between the desire for emotional safety and the need for emotional truth. And this internal tension slowly transformed ordinary moments into emotional negotiations, deciding how much honesty was too much, how much silence was too little, how long one could remain emotionally invested without feeling emotionally fulfilled. And Mark began to understand that what he feared most was not losing Elena, but losing the version of himself that existed within the relationship, the self that felt grounded, familiar, predictable, even if it was no longer fully alive, while Elena feared the opposite, that by staying she was slowly losing access to parts of herself that needed change, growth, and expression. And this asymmetry created a tragic balance where both of them were protecting something different, Mark protecting the past, Elena protecting the future, and neither knew how to bridge that temporal divide without breaking the emotional structure they had built together. And in that fragile space, they began to realize that love does not always end with anger or betrayal. Sometimes it ends with quiet exhaustion, with two people still caring deeply but no longer able to meet each other in the same emotional present. And that realization felt heavier than any argument, because it offered no clear villain, no simple resolution, only the painful understanding that staying and leaving were both forms of loss, just experienced in different directions. And eventually, without any dramatic confrontation or clear turning point, Mark and Elena began to sense that what they were facing was not a decision, but a recognition, the quiet acknowledgement that the relationship had already changed shape long before they found the words to describe it. And this recognition felt less like an ending and more like a slow emotional reorientation, where both of them had to accept that the connection they were holding on to existed more in memory than in reality. And Mark noticed how his attachment was rooted in familiarity, in the comfort of shared history, in the fear of empty space where a known presence used to be, while Elena noticed how her longing was directed toward a future that didn't yet exist, a version of herself that felt impossible to reach within the current emotional structure. And this divergence didn't create anger, it created sadness of a quieter kind, the kind that comes from understanding rather than conflict. And in that sadness, they both realized that love does not always fail because it disappears. Sometimes it fails because it remains unchanged, while the people inside it evolve. And what made this realization especially painful was that there was no moment to point to, no clear mistake, no single conversation that could have saved or destroyed everything, only a gradual emotional drift that neither of them noticed until they were already standing on different internal shores, still looking at each other, still caring, but no longer able to cross the same emotional distance in both directions at once.